This award season, consider Conclave. Hailed by AFI as one of the year's best pictures, Conclave is a stunning cinematic achievement. Now nominated for 8 Academy Awards, including Best Actor, Ralph Fiennes, Best Adapted Screenplay, Peter Strawn, and Best Picture of the Year. Conclave, a film by Edward Berger, in theaters now. Happy Saturday. It's February 8th, 2025, and you are listening to Morning Meeting. I am Ashley Baker in grayer than gray London.
I'm Michael Haney in still cold, still wintry New York City.
You know, Michael, the big news this week is probably that I have seasonal affective disorder, but this is the cost that we pay for living in this lovely city of London. But, you know, I suppose some other things have been happening in the world as well. Can we please declare today to be the International Journalist Appreciation Day? I mean, what a week it has been in the news. Our friends and colleagues are Washington correspondents, and we salute you. If you ever find the time to have a cup of coffee, please, it's on us. Meanwhile, in the news, the hand-wringing over Trump's intention to turn the Gaza Strip into, and we quote, the Riviera of the Middle East continues. He has also offered to spend $100 million of his own money to build a ballroom at the White House. Not sure who's signing up for that party, but hey, I'm sure there are some. Meanwhile, the Bank of England has dropped interest rates for the third time in 6 months. Not exactly a promising sign about the fate of our economy, but hey, as usual, Airmail and Morning Meeting are the antidote to all of that. And we have a great episode of Morning Meeting here to take you inside the issue.
Exactly. And first, we've got an amazing story. Tom Goldstein was one of Washington, D.C.'s top lawyers. So successful, in fact, that he had argued more than 44 cases before the Supreme Court. Yet, few knew he was also one of the world's highest rolling and most reckless poker players, rolling up millions of dollars in wins and losses. Then his worlds collided. And as our writer George Pendle will tell us, it was in spectacular style. It's a mesmerizing story. Then we've got a story I know you will have a lot of thoughts on, Ashley. Bridget Jones. After a 25-year absence, the frazzled heroine, as portrayed by Renee Zellweger, is returning to theaters. And two of our writers, Carolina de Armas and Victoria Herman, couldn't help but wonder, more than 2 decades on, how would Bridget Jones navigate the New York City of Gen Zers? Well, they're going to tell us. And finally, speaking of movies, Stu Heritage is going to join us from London with his report on the Prince Charles Cinema. For years, this independent movie theater has been beloved by such movie greats as Quentin Tarantino and Paul Thomas Anderson, who are just a few of the cinephiles who consider it perhaps the greatest movie house in the world. But now it's under threat of closure, and Stu is going to tell us if this is indeed the last picture show. So Ashley, where would you like to start today?
Well, I think we should talk to George Pendle about this wild ride through DC's corridors of power that he takes us on. Boy, this is a strange story, Michael. It's about a lawyer with a gambling problem who's been in front of the Supreme Court way too many times, it seems, and now is looking at a very different fate. George is here to tell us all about how one charmed life went terribly wrong. George is an editor-at-large at Airmail and the author of several books, including Death, a Life, and Happy Failure. Welcome, George.
Hello.
So, George, there's no shortage of bizarre characters in DC, but Tom Goldstein, who's the subject of your fascinating investigation this week, is among the most complex. So tell us, who is this guy?
Well, on the face of it, Tom Goldstein is one of the most renowned and, one might say envied people in DC. He is one of the most well-known Supreme Court advocates. That means he argues in front of the Supreme Court, which only a handful of people really do on any regular basis. I mean, for most lawyers, arguing in front of the Supreme Court is the highlight of your career. Tom Goldstein has argued in front of it 44 times, which, for a lawyer in private practice is more than all but 3 other lawyers in the court history.
George, is this because he's an exceptionally talented litigator?
He is. It's very unusual too. Most litigators have been through, Harvard Law School. They've clerked for a Supreme Court justice, and they've worked their way up through these, very well-known milestones that a lawyer normally has to go through. But Tom Goldstein was none of those. He scraped into American University Law School, and he really got to the Supreme Court through his own kind of chutzpah. He basically worked out that one of the ways of getting in front of the Supreme Court was finding out cases that the court wanted to hear. Now, when he started in law, this was in the late 90s, really there weren't many people actively seeking out these cases. And Goldstein came up with this kind of computer algorithm to find which cases he thought the Supreme Court would take up on their docket. Now, the Supreme Court doesn't take up most cases. In fact, it takes up probably less than 1% of cases that are brought to it. But he found out this incredibly effective way of getting cases. And even though he hadn't gone to the Harvard Law School, even though he hadn't, clerked for a Supreme Court justice, he soon found himself. And this is one of the most remarkable things that really speaks to his incredible character. He found himself giving his first ever legal argument in front of the Supreme Court back in 1999. Not his first argument in front of the Supreme Court, his first ever legal argument. So that kind of gives you an idea of the kind of, incredible ambition and drive that Goldstein had.
And George, do we have a sense of how he's viewed by the justices on the court? I mean, he's a bit of a household name to them now. And what's his personality like?
So Tom Goldstein, he's a very calm, very well-spoken individual. He's obviously very intelligent, but he's not entirely liked by the Supreme Court justices. This is partly because when he got started in the late 90s, what he used to do was cold call people to try and get them to allow him to represent their cases. Now, at the time, this was seen as a real kind of faux pas. You weren't meant to chase after cases. The cases were meant to come to you as a lawyer. And, John Roberts in particular, who was in private practice at the time, John Roberts, the head of the Supreme Court, the chief, criticized him and said, you wouldn't accept heart surgery from a surgeon who cold called you. Why would you accept, representation from a lawyer who cold called you? And even to this day, I think Roberts really dislikes Goldstein's kind of not only methodology, but also his general appearance in front of the court. There are basically two types of lawyer that appear in front of the Supreme Court. One is called a heater, that kind of engages in very extreme arguments, that threatens that hellfire will follow if the justices do not follow their case. And the other is a cooler. And Goldstein is more of a cooler. Cooler is calm, collected, is very kind, very open, never gets into arguments with the justices, and he really tries to get them to believe in what he's saying without, putting everything on the line with the case. But even though Goldstein is kind of a cooler, he's seen as being a little smug. He can kind of be condescending even to the justices in the court. And so he's known as having this, kind of strange, brilliant, but a little obnoxious character.
Goldstein has long been a fixture of the chattering classes of DC, but this week he's made a lot of news for a reason completely unrelated to his work on the court. So how has he become enmeshed in this scandal?
Well, it was actually a couple of weeks ago. He was served with a 50-page, 22-count federal indictment accusing him of massive tax evasion. Now, nobody saw this coming. For whatever you may have thought of Tom Goldstein as being too smug or being too successful, nobody saw him as a crook and, as an alleged crook, we should say. And so this federal indictment just came out of the blue. And the legal community, which is pretty close-knit, we're just up in arms about it, wondering how this could happen, not least because the federal indictment had an incredible list of the wildest gambling stories you could possibly imagine. I mean, it included stories of, multi-million-dollar poker games in Macau. It involved stories of Goldstein carrying duffel bags full of cash through Dulles Airport in DC, back to his office. And it included stories of him keeping almost a dozen women on the books of his law firm, paying them off while they did no work whatsoever. So it was this real kind of unveiling. Behind this cool, calm, collected Supreme Court advocate was revealed this kind of gambling and sex-addled drug fiend.
George, as you kind of say, I mean, in your piece, you talk about him as when he gets into poker, and I love you describe him. There's three kinds of poker players, as they say. There's almost like Supreme Court people making case rather than heater and cooler. There's tight, loose, and then there's the maniac, and he was known as a maniac among maniacs, right?
That's right. There isn't really a comparison in the Supreme Court for the maniac at the poker table.
So it sounds like he had this whole alternate personality, right? Can you tell us more about that?
That's right. It's kind of extraordinary. While he was at the poker table, he would play in the most unbelievable way. I mean, even for hardcore poker players, the way he played was ridiculous, absurd, as if he cared about money not a jot. He used to play for hours on end without even looking at his cards. And, he used to use his ability to judge what other people had just by looking at their faces. But still, not even the greatest poker player in the world would choose not to look at their cards. But so this was one kind of aspect of him. He was, renowned for gambling hours at a time. He would gamble. Lawyers are wealthy, but they're not that wealthy. They're not super multimillionaires, billionaires. And he was playing with billionaires and multimillionaires as if it didn't matter at all, as if he didn't care, as if he could lose everything on a moment's notice.
And how much money are we talking about, George? How much debt did he incur?
Well, somewhere in the region, it's hard to work out exactly how much debt he has at the moment. But in the federal indictment, it lists him winning around $50 million and then losing all of that and possibly another $14 million on top. So this wasn't small stakes gambling. He was gambling millions at a time and winning millions, but eventually it caught up with him and he just ended up losing a considerable amount of money.
Was it known among his colleagues in legal circles that he had this gambling addiction, dare we say?
Not at all. I mean, he was known as somebody who would play poker. There was a story in the Washington Post in 2008 that he had won a local charity tournament playing poker, the grand prize of which was $2,000, which he donated to charity. But that was really the extent of it. People knew he was, a fan of poker. He actually represented some of the early online poker businesses. But nobody knew that he was this maniac, that he was a man who would play hours on end, that he would, take drugs, he would sleep with lots of women, he would fire bazookas or machine guns in the desert of Las Vegas. Nobody had this idea of him. It was quite different to how he portrayed himself in DC.
I mean, it seems like he took up with some rather unsavory characters when he was not arguing in front of the Supreme Court.
Well, a lot of the story comes from the memoir of Dan Bilzerian, a self-published memoir, I should say. Dan Bilzerian, for those who don't know, is the self-crowned king of Instagram. He has around 30 million followers. And Bilzerian actually describes meeting Goldstein in the Bellagio Hotel's poker room and coming in and just seeing him playing without looking at his cards and just saying, who is this maniac? Now, Bilzerian is, he's the classic modern misogynist male role model, kind of Andrew Tate-esque. He's muscle-bound. He likes firing heavy guns. He likes driving fast cars. He's always shown surrounded by women in bikinis. And he's pretty much the opposite of what you would imagine Tom Goldstein to be. Tom Goldstein is he's balding, he's pasty, he's drab looking. But somehow in the poker room, they saw something in each other that they wanted. Dan Bilzerian saw in Tom Goldstein this absolute crazy, inability to care about the rest of the world, which Bilzerian saw as a kind of great thing. And Goldstein saw in Bilzerian, obviously, this lifestyle that really Washington, D.C. did not afford him, did not allow him. And the two became firm friends after.
So what is fate looking like for Goldstein? I mean, what are the stakes here? Could he possibly end up in prison, or do you think he's going to be able to argue himself out of this one too?
Well, it's interesting. There's as you can imagine in DC, everybody has a theory as to how the legal case will go. One of the biggest problems is that he applied for a mortgage without actually revealing the extent of his debt, which turns out to be quite a serious financial crime. A lot of the, tax evasion he could probably pay off and wouldn't have jail time, but filing for a mortgage without revealing all your debt, carries, I think, a maximum of 20 years in prison. Many people think that what he will end up doing is taking a plea deal. And this, one can only imagine, has a lot of the gamblers he played with as far afield as Macau and Los Angeles and Texas must have them very worried. And Dan Bilzerian, his old friend, must be worried too, because one can only imagine that a lot of poker players don't have exactly regular financial circumstances.
Will he be able to argue his own case?
Well, you know what they say? I think they say a person who chooses to defend themselves chooses an idiot for their lawyer. And I think he might well choose to have somebody else. In fact, he has chosen, notably, 2 lawyers to represent him who represented Donald Trump when he was fighting his January 6th indictment. He has those representatives. He has Risa Heller, one of the well-known disaster PR specialists, on his side. He says he's going to fight this as best he can, but who knows what else will come out of the woodwork now the federal indictment has been filed.
One thing's for sure, George, it's going to make a fabulous movie.
Indeed.
I feel like the production companies helmed by Bradley Cooper, Brad Pitt, and Ben Affleck are all going to go to war over bidding on this story. So George, get ready. Let's make this happen.
Ben Affleck loves to gamble, knows a thing or two.
George, if that happens, Michael and I want tickets to the premiere. Not kidding. Love you. All right, well, let's move on to something else that we love, which is Bridget Jones, the latest film in the franchise created by Helen Fielding with her 1995 Bridget Jones's Diary novel, is out in theaters on Valentine's Day of all possible days. And as a result, we, of course, had to revisit what made Bridget Bridget and how would she fare in New York City in 2025. And on that note, we have two of our airmail colleagues, Victoria Herman and Carolina de Armas, here to explain Bridget 2.0. Welcome, ladies.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having us.
So, ladies, I think it's safe to say that you all are members of Gen Z. Is that correct?
Yes.
I'm right on the cusp. I'm the first month of Gen Z.
Okay, so when Bridget Jones's Diary, which was the novel by Helen Fielding, came out in 1995, you were not born, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
What's a novel?
What's a novel? Michael, come on.
Okay, I'll go away again. Go ahead, ladies.
Again.
Continue.
Sorry, this is a conversation is not for you, Michael. Sorry. So when did you all first become aware of Bridget Jones? Was it through the films, the Renee Zellweger-ification of it all? Tell us.
Films. I'm pretty sure I watched it around the year 2010. So that's a few years after the first movie came out. I immediately became a fan.
Ditto. I think I watched it in that same, when you're finally becoming aware of Legally Blonde, 50 First Dates, all these 27 Dresses, all these different rom-coms. And I love Bridget Jones. Watched The Edge of Reason right away too.
Were you kind of shocked by her behavior and proclivities, or did you find her more of a sort of straightforward heroine?
I remember thinking that I wanted to be her. I remember thinking that I couldn't wait until I could have a glass of wine and cry over a guy who didn't like me back. Because again, I watched it in 2010, so I was 10 years old. There's like this saying that people say on the internet about Sex and the City, which is like people should watch, or more specifically, girls should watch Sex and the City before they're 25 and then after they're 25. And I think the same thing goes for Bridget Jones. When I watched it most recently this Christmas, and I think Victoria did the same because it's one of my favorite Christmas films because of the whole holiday party, I remember just resonating with it even more because it's honestly just hilarious and comforting.
There's been a bit of an anti-Bridget backlash, Victoria. Have you been following this at all? You know, like she's not especially woke. Some of, her values might seem a bit perverted by today's standards.
I think Bridget is a barometer of the culture and how women are perceived. And so if it seems that way now, I think it's just more of a reflection of values and perceptions of women at the time. But I agree, it's absurd that she weighs, 136 pounds and she wants to lose 20 and she's seen as overweight and wants to lose 20 pounds. That's certainly crazy by today's standards. I hope that for the average woman in 1995, that was upsetting too, but maybe it wasn't. Another thing that's interesting is that in this most recent film, supposedly her love interest is a much younger man. And I think that's another reflection of an update in the culture. We've seen all these films recently, like Baby Girl, The Idea of You, where it's now, acceptable and encouraged and hot for a much older woman to be with a younger man. But now all these movies are coming out and no one's really batting an eye.
Okay, so if Bridget Jones were trying to make a life for herself in contemporary New York City, what would that look like?
Well, she lives in a West Village walk-up is what we decided would be most accurate for her. And she still works in publishing, specifically Skyhorse Publishing, this independent publisher that one fact about them is that they've published, I think, what does it say here? 35 titles about the assassination of John F. Kennedy. She still has all of her same friends. We pointed out that she still has her gay best friend who is now like a one-hit wonder TikToker. She still has her journalist best friend, but, judging by how journalism sort of works these days, she's now a freelancer. And then she also has the investment banker best friend who's crying in bathroom, and that we decided stays the same.
Okay, but what about Daniel Cleaver? Because workplace dynamics have changed considerably. Flirting with one's boss or flirting with one's subordinate is now considered a definite no-no.
Correct. And that is, we decided that Danielle Cleaver, that's why we decided that Daniel Cleaver is now Danielle Cleaver, just because it takes the load off a bit from the whole inappropriateness of the situation. And also just because, Gen Z is considerably more bi than Gen X.
Speaking of inappropriate, what about Mr. Fitzherbert, her boss's
Pervert?
boss? Yes, otherwise known as Tits Pervert. Where's he these days?
He'd be gone. He was Me Too'd in 2017, along with so many pervy bosses.
He was cut in 2017, Me Too'd, so he's out.
Oh dear. Okay. So one of Bridget's most memorable qualities was her complete fixation on trying to better herself by losing weight, quitting drinking, and laying off the cigarettes. Where do we find her now all these years later?
Still struggling to do all of those things. There's some things that change a lot, but those are all her New Year's resolutions would be the same nowadays. And I think for women then and women now, it's still the same battles that we're fighting. But she would have incorporated Zyn into her life, not just cigarettes. Nowadays, you walk around New York and you don't just see the outline of a carton in people's pockets. It's that telltale circle. And I think Bridget would be maybe even falling asleep with a Zyn in her mouth and waking up the morning after with a dried pack on her pillow.
I just have to clarify for non-Gen Z, Zyn is not Zinfandel.
No.
That's ZYN, the tobacco that's favored by RFK Jr.
Yes.
RFK Jr. Zins?
He was popping Zyn at his Senate confirmation hearings.
Doesn't that cause autism?
Well, it's also like the guy's a nominee for Health and Human Services. It's a whole other episode, but let's stay focused on this.
The steroid conversation is one for another day as well, Michael. Anyway, we'll get there. So do you think Bridget Jones would be using Ozempic?
Oh.
We discussed having that, and I don't think that she would. I feel like if anything, she would probably apply in one of those like weird online get Ozempic applications, and then she wouldn't be approved, and then she'd lie about her weight again to get it and wouldn't be approved either. But I don't think she'd ever actually do Ozempic. She doesn't have her life in order enough to know a guy who knows a guy, or to just have a physician in her life who will be able to get it for her.
There's an authenticity and a sense of dishevelment to Bridget that just make it seem that Ozempic and her, they're just never going to meet.
She's kind of all over the place, and what I found very funny about her is she had an existential fear in that first one. Could you tell us what her fear was then and what it is now in your imagining?
Victoria and I discussed this with our editor, Julia, and her existential fear in the movie was being eaten by dogs following death by spinsterdom. And then we were just like talking about what really scares women these days. And it's always, dating on the apps is always scary. It's scary when someone lies about who they are. Specifically, when a boy lies about his height is a big thing that scares women nowadays, because there's like this general rule that if he says 6 foot, then it's 5'10". If he says 5'10", then it's 5'7", so on and so forth. And then, of course, that guy who is short being also a serial killer or a murderer who will cut you up and put you in a suitcase. And that's exactly what Lee wrote down.
So guys, how much, for someone of my age, which is to say considerably older than the two of you, like this is the event of the season. Like I don't think I've been as excited about anything. And I include, King Charles' coronation as I am about Bridget Jones, mad about the boy coming to theaters near you very soon. How are people in your generation feeling about this? Is it quite as frenzied?
Frankly, no. Is it just me?
Ouch. Shots fired. You guys were quiet. You just went silent with that question.
I'm excited to see it. I'm on the edge of my seat.
You sound apologetic about it, but sure, go ahead.
Yeah, I know. I can't name any friends of mine who can't wait to get into that movie theater to see it.
Ashley's crying right now. She just, she can't even imagine this.
No, actually, I've been sufficiently disappointed by the Sex and the City movies that I know that this is not going to be the cinematic event that I hope for. But I'm still there. I'm seeing it on the 13th, Thursday night at 5:00 at the Everyman Theater in Marylebone. So, such is life. Even if it sucks, I'm going to bring a lot of red wine. It's all good. I'll do what Bridget would do. Well, ladies, thank you so much for this great story. Thank you for keeping the dream of Bridget alive and updating it for today's world.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
This award season, consider Conclave. Hailed by AFI as one of the year's best pictures, Conclave is a stunning cinematic achievement. Now nominated for 8 Academy Awards, including Best Actor, Ralph Fiennes, Best Adapted Screenplay, Peter Strawn, and Best Picture of the Year. Conclave, a film by Edward Berger, in theaters now. Okay, Michael, well, if there's one theater where I would love to see Bridget Jones, Mad About the Boy, it would be at the Prince Charles Cinema in Leicester Square. But the good times might not continue forever at that beloved treasure of a cinema. As Stu Heritage reports in the issue this week, its future is in jeopardy. Stu is a writer at large for Airmail. Welcome, Stu Heritage. So, Stu, you take us inside the world of London property, which is one of our favorite topics this week, with a bit of a spat concerning the Prince Charles Cinema. Now, for the uninitiated, what exactly is this cinema and why is it so important?
The Prince Charles Cinema is, I think, perhaps one of the best places in all of London. It's in Leicester Square, which it's in itself it's a horrible kind of, it's a place for tourists. And for the most part, no Londoner in their right mind would ever go to Leicester Square. It's where the M&M shop is, basically, now. But just if you go like 20 feet outside Leicester Square, there's this amazing cinema that shows old films and cult films and hard to find films and sing-along films. And it's, the Prince Charles Cinema. And last week, the cinema announced that it was kind of bracing itself for closure. Their landlords want to renegotiate their contract to include a break clause, basically, which means if they ever get the chance to redevelop it, the cinema has 6 months to clear out, as well as jacking up rent prices. So the cinema put out this petition that's just been signed hundreds of thousands of times because it's such a beloved institution.
Well, it's kind of fabulous when something like this can really galvanize the arts-loving, population here of the UK. But I mean, I suppose it makes sense that when you think about the rent that's generated by the M&M store, a cinema's earnings would be somewhat paltry in comparison, no?
It is, but last year was the Prince Charles Cinema's most successful year ever. It's been going since 1962. It's taken more money last year than it has done in its entire history. So, I mean, it has that going for it. And also, don't you think, not to be a hippie about it, but don't you think some things are worth more than money? Don't you think that a cultural institution is worth more in terms of real estate than an M&M shop?
Well, Stu, on that note, of course I do. I mean, is there any hope that there could be some deep-pocketed philanthropist who swoops in and saves the day, or perhaps, the government in some way might get involved? What are our chances here of keeping this thing alive?
I think government intervention is quite a good idea, and it's likely. So I feel like mainly the point of the petition is to spook the landlords into realizing what it has, that they know they've got, that there's this valuable place that people love. It might work. But then again, the landlord was called during COVID. He got the nickname the meanest landlord in London. So I don't think necessarily he'll take too kindly to this sort of threat.
Yeah, he doesn't seem like a guy who's easily intimidated.
Yeah, no, completely. Maybe they'll relocate it, but then typically when this happens, they'll move it to the sort of the outside of London if it does, and then it won't be the same.
Well, Stu, I mean, there are so few cinemas inside London proper already, as I know, because I've been trying to secure tickets for Bridget Jones' Mad About the Boy next week, which is opening. What gives? Is this sort of cinema universe in jeopardy here in the UK? Are we going to just have to watch everything at home on streaming?
Yeah, cinemas are in real trouble. Cineworld is, I think, it's the biggest operator, and it's closing branches all over the place. I don't think cinemas have recovered since COVID. I think they were probably on a bit of a downward spiral pre-COVID, but people have got out of the habit of going out and watching a film. It's one of my favorite things to do, and to go to somewhere like the Prince Charles where you can literally turn up at any point and there'll be a film that you either love or you will love after you've seen it. I feel like it's keeping the faith in a way that the cinema industry needs.
Stu, do we know anything about who runs the Prince Charles Cinema? And also, was it named for King Charles? I mean, what do we know about that?
It was, yeah. And famously, when on Coronation Day, they put on their big billboard, "No, we're not changing our name." It's been lots of things over the years. It opened in 1962 as a theatre. It was a theatre with a nightclub above it. And apparently the nightclub is where the Beatles first took LSD. So there alone, there's history. And then it sort of fell into a state of disrepair and became a porn cinema where it showed Emmanuel non-stop for 3 years. It was just the sellout place to go. And then in the 90s, it was taken over by the people who run it now. And they turned it into it began with sort of £1 tickets to try and get people in. And then over the years, they've shown more and more, sort of art house cult films. They do The Room, Tommy Wiseau's The Room, famously the worst film ever made. They show that regularly. And Tommy Wiseau turns up now and it's a big, big event and people throw spoons at him and yell. It's fantastic. They do sing-along Sound of Music screenings. They do sing-along Grease. I saw on the website, but I haven't been to, they do a solve-along Murder, She Wrote night where you get to try and figure out who the murderer is in real time with all of your friends. It's the sort of cinema I think everyone wishes that they had in their neighborhood.
Except this neighborhood happens to be Leicester Square, where no one would dare to go, with the exception of this cinema, but that's another story.
Is there a favorite film or double feature you've seen there?
Yeah, I've seen a few. I went to see The Room with my friends, and that was great. That was a fun time. They always show Muppet Christmas Carol at Christmas, which is weird because it's a room full of sort of crying 40-year-old people, which is strange. I've just seen, my son is really into Godzilla all of a sudden, and I've just seen every 2 weeks they're showing consecutively all of the original Japanese Godzilla films. So we're going to that soon, and it's such a great place. It's not, you don't go there for the seats necessarily or the comfort or the experience. You just go because it's run by people who love what they do.
It's amazing, as well, because, what you're saying is everyone's habits have changed post-COVID. And even this season, I'll ask her stuff is out and I'm talking to people people I know who love movies just haven't gotten to theaters. And, you see it in New York. And you've got big stuff like Brutalist and stuff, which demands to be seen in the theater, or Gladiator 2 when it comes. It's I think I'll see it at home. And I get it. It's easier, but boy, just having Film Forum here in New York City, the ability to go into a theater and see something on screen, I don't know, it seems such an endangered little subculture now.
It really is. I'm going to go and see The Brutalist. It comes out here on Friday, so I'm going to see it on Friday evening, into the night, way into the night, because it's so long. But I feel like that's the sort of film that if I was watching it at home, I would spread it out over a week. I'd watch it in sort of half an hour here, 45 minutes there, just and sort of arrange it around my life. But going to see it in a theatre, where it makes a huge demand of your time, I think you've got to sort of respect that. You've got to respect the vision in which it was made.
Yeah, and to see these films that, it's great to discover something, but also then to see it on screen, it's been said a billion times, but it's just to see it as it was originally intended to be seen. I don't know. I keep hoping that, that sort of bloom that came to vinyl records that's happened, the Gen Zers will soon start to move back towards cinema. Maybe that's the play for them, but we'll see if it happens in time.
Maybe it will. And I think if that happens, it won't be the multiplexes that they go to. They won't go and see the Marvel films necessarily because they know they can get that on Disney. It'll be cinemas like the Prince Charles where you can go and be trusted that it's being curated. You're watching something that's being chosen by the actual film lovers.
Well, Stu, thank you so much. And all we can say is, let's hope the lights stay on. And also, save the aisle seat for me.
Have a great day, Stu. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
There's only one place to discover a global snapshot of the current cultural scene. Airmail's Arts Intel Report. Our international research tool for what to do and where and when to do it is user-friendly, continuously updated, and meticulously curated. Arts Intel is handy at home, on the road, and when you're planning your next trip. It also includes indispensable lists of restaurants and hotels in key cities around the world, recommended by our well-traveled experts. Explore Arts Intel at airmail.news/arts-intel, and be sure to sign up for our Week in Culture newsletter, which is published every Wednesday afternoon at airmail.news/WIC. I'm Chris Garrett, Airmail Deputy Editor, and I never leave home without it. Bon voyage.
God, Michael. It seems like all the good things in the world are just going away, and we're just left with the detritus.
Come on, can't be that gloomy.
All right, Michael. Well, I suppose you're right. But I know you've got something delightful, cheerful, life-affirming, some sort of cultural recommendation for me.
It's a movie that came out recently starring Cillian Murphy, and it was his first role he did after Oppenheimer, and it's a small film called Small Things Like These. It's based on a story by Claire Keegan, and if you have not read her books, do so now, immediately. This is my little recommendation. Inside the recommendation, she's a fantastic writer. In the movie, Murphy plays a man in Ireland who begins to suspect a horrible truth about a home for unwed mothers. It's based, in some ways, inspired by true events. But he is great, as is Emily Watson. It's called Small Things Like These, and it's streaming on Apple now. And you, my dear?
Okay, so I've spoken before on the show about my love of Motherland, which was a show on the BBC about a group of mothers in the Queen's Park neighborhood of London who are fumbling their way through life with lots of hilarious happenings along the way. And now there's a spinoff of that show called Amanda Land, and it focuses on Lucy Punch's character in Motherland, who is a beautiful, blonde, entrepreneurial alpha mom who all of the other moms sort of loved to hate and hated to love. And it's really wonderful. Lucy Punch is such a fantastic actress. And in this show, she is really at her best as one of those mothers who just seems to do everything better than everyone else and have all of the answers. And we all know people like that. And that's why one of the reasons why this show is so much fun to watch and enjoy. So it's called Amanda Land on the BBC. Exactly the antidote we need to these troubled times. And you cannot watch it in the US unless you have a VPN. But if you don't have a VPN, it's high time to get one, if only for this show. Well, on that note, we wish you a wonderful weekend. We would like to thank our sponsor, Conclave. See it now in theaters. Consider it for the Oscars if you are voting. Michael, will you please read us out?
Morning Meeting is produced by Airplay Productions and edited by Jesse Cannon. Our coders are Graydon Carter and Alexander Stanley. Our Chief Operating Officer is Bill Keenan, and our deputers are Ashley Baker, Chris Garrett, Nathan King, Jill Vitale, and Ash Carter. Our CMO is Emily Davis, and our music supervisor is Randall Poster. Our theme music is The Cute Monster by the Buddy Collette Quintet. A new edition of Airmail is published every Saturday, so please subscribe and enjoy all of our stories on airmail.news, which we update every day. You can also find us on Twitter and Instagram at Airmail Weekly. We will be back here next Saturday with another edition of Morning Meeting, but in the meantime, be sure to subscribe to Spotify or Apple Music. But most of all, thank you again for joining us.